Oh, who's
secretary?
Amen. Thanks, Lonnie. Appreciate that. Thanks for all of the hard work in that too. Thanks for everybody staying around. We'll promise to try to stick to with this an hour. I thought that we might share some thoughts. The clergy left their session with a question that I had for them, and I'm going to not address that particularly. I'll come back to that with our clergy. But since it's a combined session, we'll talk a little bit more about some research that I've been doing recently. Basically, I've been with the Adaptive Leadership Gurus 2 weeks ago. I was with Heifetz and Linsky for their executive ed course, and it was very fascinating. I went for content on adaptive leadership because I kind of have all their reading stuff, and it was nothing about content. It's all about process. And so let me share a few things with you. And so the first question I want to ask or pose to you is this one. What change needs to take place in your local church? What change needs to take place in your local church to leverage the greatest impact on making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world? Okay? What change? We'll get to some answers, but and so what I want you to do is think about that, and then turn. If you wanted to pair with your lay leader, by the way, the clergy, to talk about this, that'd be perfectly okay. If you don't want to do that, that's okay too. But I want you to share that with another person. So just turn to another person or threes and share what change do you think would make the biggest impact on the church's ability to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Okay? Go ahead. And then we're going to get some general answers from all of you. You need to find somebody, wave, and here comes Phil. Phil needs a partner. Okay, kind of wrap up. Anybody willing to share some of their thoughts? Anybody have some that they felt were particularly helpful for each other? Anybody would like to share? Sure. Not yet.
There we go.
There we go.
From a laity perspective, I think one of the things that I think is helpful in that process is when it's not the pastor or the pastor and staff that does everything. When we have an understanding that it is everybody that's equipped and sent out into the world, and when as a layperson I'm not just given tasks to do, that I'm not a volunteer, but that I'm given authority to go out and act on behalf of the church, to be empowered to do the work that is the church's work, and that it's not just me empowering and equipping our staff or our pastors and then sending them out in the world, that it's in fact the other way around.
Good. Excellent. Now that's the paradigm that I'm working with out of the book Spiritual Kaizen. So I think this clergy should have gotten a copy. Did you all get a copy, Dave? Didn't they send the books up here? Oh no, didn't we send you 30 copies for all the clergy? No? Oh, okay. Not. I think Gretchen had them ship them up for you guys, free for the clergy. Okay, well you'll get it. We'll double check on that. They did that last month, so you guys should have gotten it already. Okay, I'll check on that, but all the clergy should have gotten a copy. No. Hold out for your free copy. The clergy, anyway, and then you can pass it down. Yeah, I talk a little bit about that paradigm of consumer mentality. So the consumer mentality of the church is the mainstream model, which is based on the mall principle. And that is that you come to church, you get services, and for the services, you're willing to commit a pledge. And it's a really individualistic consumer model that is really harming our church, because you're there to be entertained for an hour. Even that paradigm, you want entertainment, and if it's not entertaining, then you leave. That's really totally anti-missional and gospel mandate. So Nora's exactly right. You must be given not only responsibility but authority to make decisions. And think about our laity. You're not given the authority, responsibility level. You're just given task to be done. And that's not consistent with the biblical mandate. Biblical mandate is in your baptism, you are given all the powers of Jesus Christ. All the powers. And for you ordained, I know you're set aside, but your laity really have that power, and that's the paradigm that we should be working on. Okay? So, anyway.
Did you say Nora is exactly right one more time?
Nora, you were right on that one. Exactly right. Yeah. Spiritual Kaizen.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Any other comments? Sure, Dan. Your major change thrust.
Yeah. I'll venture a comment that has to do more with lay leadership. Since I'm a retiring clergy, I can be brave today. I think that entrenched lay leadership comes about sometimes in our smaller churches.
You got it.
And they kind of hang on to power out of a fear that, well, nobody else can do it, and things might fall apart, or there might be changes that we don't like. And I think it's very difficult for clergy then to bring about some new ideas that they've heard about at annual conference or from reading or whatever.
That's right.
And some clergy maybe are so skilled that they can sometimes pull it off and get some amount of change, but it takes quite a bit of skill.
Yep.
And patience and all kinds of things. And sometimes it doesn't come out that way, and you end up getting in a butting head situation.
That's right.
And really, there's lots of other lay leadership. And I like the thing the discipline says is after 3 years, it's expected that lay leadership should change.
Right.
And there's some exceptions to that, but that should be the general rule, and then exceptions can be made. But I think if that was practiced more widely in our annual conference, it would be very beneficial, because there's lots of lay leadership that has new ideas and wants to try things, especially the younger people that are looking at our churches with older leadership, and it's like they don't really want to say a word. They're afraid to. They don't want to stand out, and they just, I don't know, probably
You got it. Okay, so here's another one. This is the same scenario as the clergy dilemma, which I really want to address as a thought process. Our clergy have become clericalized to the point that they are the power centers in the church, except in small churches where the matriarch or patriarch has all the power. All right, now it's a false bankrupt model of leadership. And here's the bankruptcy. You have the two entities, let's say matriarch, patriarch, or clergy, and just the average parishioner. The parishioner gives away responsibility or gives away power to the leader in exchange for a service which is take care of me. It's an exchange that takes place. So whoever is the authority has power, but it's an exchange that's taking place. Now that's a bankrupt model of leadership that, again, I try to address. This does not solve the adaptive problems that we're going to have, because the problems are too immense for any one person to give away power to. What is the Heifetz model, the Minsky model, is get rid of this. And what it has to be in the extent of exchange is what they call distributive leadership. That power is everybody's, and that all of you should exercise power. So this is against any one person or authority having power, because it won't work. It works with technical problems. So if you have something that can be solved, no problem, authority can do that. As soon as it becomes an adaptive problem, or I'm using the term wicked problems now after another person, Roger Martin, out of Toronto School of Management. Wicked problems are always those that morph into deeper and more complex problems. There's no easy solution. All right? So we've got to change our whole orientation on what leadership is. All right? So here's where, let me just share a little bit about this. 70 to 90% of all corporate change initiatives fail. And it's more on the higher 90 side now, but depends on the research study that you have. So these are people who have millions of dollars. They hire the top professionals. They do a system-wide change, and they fail. So if the big corporate entities can't pull it off, then how do we pull it off? That's the dilemma that we're facing. And so we've got to look at change in a totally different way. And so let me share a little bit about this. If we think of our church as a U, we have a past, we have the present, and we have a future. And what really we have to do is the past is deciding what we're going to keep and what we need to give up. You're going to keep most of what has made the church, which is our values, core values, and who we are. Love, justice, you name it. Redemption, forgiveness, those are all core values that we'll keep. But we have to give up something in order to have a future. So the question is this one right here. We pretty much know what we need to keep. But here's the interesting thing. The DNA difference between a human being and a chimpanzee is very small. The early research had it at 99%, 98.6%. We shared DNA. Now, recent studies have changed that a little bit. It's much more complex. Probably we share maybe 96% of the same DNA. All right? That's still a huge amount, right? And notice the evolutionary difference between us and chimpanzees. We've made the huge leap with only 4% difference in DNA. So what we're saying is you may only have to give up 2 to 4% of the way the church is doing things. You can keep 94% of our heritage, but this 2 to 4% is monumental in some kind of leap that's going to take place. The future is, what is that 2 or 4% change going to make? It's innovation, experimentation, and adaptation. If we're going to have a future at all, it's going to be in the changes, the pluses that we take on to become a viable entity. All right? So, here's the bottom line. Again, try to spell this out in the book. If the average age of our United Methodist layperson is 58 years old, we got about a 15-year window to turn it around. So, what you've got to concentrate on is this innovative 2%, let's say, that is going to monumentally change the fabric of your local church. And what it's got us around, folks, is younger people, different people, and people whom probably the society has rejected in some ways. We've got to find a way to reach a whole new niche. And Alaska would be a perfect place because of the diversity of the population here. All right? So it's all about how you're going to innovate, experiment, and adapt for that future. And again, it's a very small percentage. You just got to find what's going to be the biggest leverage point for you. All right? Now, one thing that about change is why we don't like change is because it involves a loss. And that's what people don't want to deal with. So that matriarch and patriarch, what are they losing? Power, influence. Clergy too. What are we losing? Our sense of competency, whatever. All of these things are factors in loss. And what the adaptive folks say is there's going to be casualties. And the church is so loving and sort of compassionate, we don't want to lose anybody. That's a pipe dream, folks. There's going to be losses. People are going to quit. Change is difficult. You're going to have to give up some things. Only 2%, but even that, people will fight tooth and nail because it's their lives that have changed. And so what we've got to realize is casualties will happen, and you can't be afraid of tackling that head on. And that's been the church's problem with change. All right? Oh, our biggest giver doesn't like that. I guess we can't change that decision. Oh, there's a faction over here who, if we do that change, they'll leave. Can't do that. All of those scenarios are, we have to have the courage to realize that if this change is really going to pull us into a bright future, we've got to make it. And there's going to be casualties. All right? So that leads to the second question for you. How much loss, how much conflict can you bear? All right? So I want you to turn to your neighbor again and talk about this one. How much loss can your church undertake? How much loss can you personally are willing to undertake? Because to change, I've got to change, and I've got to lose something. Okay? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Sure.
Can I address one problem, though, also, that it's in...
It was on.
It also in priority, like in Alaska and in the smaller churches, we have people who, it's more important to go to their kids' or grandkids' soccer game than it is to go to church.
Sure.
So how does that fit in?
Oh, definitely. So the average, the average of a active worship attender was 3 out of 4 Sundays or 4 out of 4 Sundays in the past. Now it's down to 2. You're an active church member if you can make 2 Sundays out of the month. Yeah, that's just the new standard. That's and everybody lies on the National Post that say they're an active church member. They all lie. More likely, they've adapted themselves to say they're active if they go 2 Sundays out of the month. All right. So you're going to have to again innovate to figure out what is the meaning of active, and can you? There's one church, for example, in Southern California that is developing a whole spiritual track for young parents and families who have sports events or Girl Scouts or any kind of events. They take with them on Sunday, and they do the devotional in the car as they're driving to the church. They developed a whole packet of devotional activities for the active non-church on that particular Sunday constituency. And that keeps them close then to their rootage of the church. So innovation again, folks. We've got to figure these things out. So competition is one of your main problems, or our main problems, is the competition for attention or presence. It's critical for us. And we're competing not only with other denominations, other faiths, but also with secular activities. Why are the malls filled on Sunday morning? Well, that's probably our fault as well as the society's fault. Yeah. Okay, so go back to the question, what are you willing to give up? How much change, how much loss can you tolerate? How much loss can your church tolerate? So just share a little bit with each other about those kind of questions. Okay, if you could kind of wrap up. Well, any thoughts on tolerance level of conflict and how much loss you're willing to bear? Is there any thoughts that had you realized something about yourself? Yeah.
I think
It's on.
one of the first things that came to my mind, based on our own experience, is that we try to avoid the conflict.
Yes.
We don't want to recognize it.
That's right.
And until it reaches a point where it's deadly, rather than something. It's not in our case. It moved from being a conflict of ideas to a conflict of personality.
I hear you.
And that destroyed our whole approach. And it took us a lot of effort and move from there. But this kind of, when you're talking about consumers and so forth, going to the mall and that sort of thing, it also reminded me that a lot of this is carried over into the me.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What counts? Me. Am I satisfied? It's not. What's the goals of the group? It's me, and we are not open to some of the ideas, or able to express some of the ideas that make it our goal is for the group,
that's right,
rather than for me. And the last point we came up with was that in some cases they always play the trump card. We can't afford it. And
sure,
generally, if the situation continues to evolve, in our case, the patriarchs and so forth made sure we couldn't afford it.
I hear you.
By the way they budgeted or didn't approve things and so forth.
Yep.
And those are the three things we came up with.
That's brilliant. And you guys are right on the money on all of those. And you know what the adaptive people call this? They call it work avoidance. All of those things are work avoidance. They're avoiding the real work that needs to be done by moving into technical fixes that kind of make people, their anxiety lower. And so what really we're talking about is if you're going to really leverage change, you got to be comfortable with challenge and anxiety and keeping that on the front burner. Urgency is another word that we use. All right. And so this is the perfect example of this is one that Heifetz and Linsky use all the time. And that is that when you start asking tough questions and pushing people in adaptive issues, and these are all adaptive, you raise the urgency level and the challenge level to the point where there is going to be conflict and anxiety. And they said if it becomes too high, then people become paralyzed. They also, you have open hostility. That's not good. But they think it's worse to be too low because the leader always tries to reduce the anxiety of the organization, and you go to technical fixes, such as, why don't we try to compromise on this situation? Why don't we avoid taking on this tough challenge? Why don't we do a Bible study about it? Those are all sort of work avoidance issues. Now, you can do a very good Bible study that continues to put the pressure on. But what they're shooting for is the place in between too high and too low. And this is what they call the zone of productive equilibrium. Zone of productive disequilibrium. Okay? And this is when people feel the urgency and the need to change, and you stay with that middle zone. And see, this is what the church avoids all the time. Why? Because you don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers. You don't want people to leave. You want everybody to love everybody. Okay? That's not going to work if we're going to tackle some of this innovative changes that you're going to need to work on. In fact, Heifetz and Linsky purposely rile up people in their work. We were in a group of about 85, and they're all world-class consultants, educators, high government officials. Superintendents of Boston schools was in our group, and they just go around and say, "Why do you need to talk so much to all of us?" I mean, people have these problems, and so they just call people out like that, and really make them really upset. But what they were doing was they're upping the urgency about the change that needs to take place, not in just the group, but within ourselves. Heifetz went up to this one woman from Puerto Rico who does a major leadership for the whole country, and he just pressed her, and she started coming back about, "Well, you're being racially insensitive, et cetera, et cetera." He says, "That's nonsense." And she got really offended. She shut down the whole couple days, but then in the end, they tried to tell you that's the way we work, because we want you to feel a challenge. Otherwise, you coast on your authority, because these were all high authority figures, by the way. All right? So, this zone of productive disequilibrium is something that we've got to tackle. If we're going to change it all, we've got to not be afraid of loss and casualties, but the innovative part of this is in this zone. If we start going back to technical fixes on things, nothing's going to change. And we're just sort of work avoidance. Okay? So, here, let me give you an example. Color of rugs. All right? Work avoidance is, it's got to be green because it's been green for 50 years. Well, green does not turn on young people. We've got to change to some color scheme that's going to be consistent with younger generations. No. Okay, so the whole church is split over the color of the rug. And we laugh at this, but it's true. That is work avoidance, folks. They're arguing over something so silly that the adaptive people would point that out immediately and say, "Why are you guys fixated on this when the deeper problem is the power struggle that's going on inside of you in this group?" That's the one we got to tackle. I don't care what the rug is, but let's use that as dealing with what's going on in this congregation. And then the anxiety raises, right? Because I'm getting called out. We're not avoiding the work. We're in the zone of productive disequilibrium to the point that we can really settle some of these long-term differences that we've had and to really talk about it and name it. So they talk a lot about diagnosing what your congregation, the culture of your congregation. What is that culture that's going on in there? If you can figure that out, then you've got an idea of what you need to keep, give up, and then move to change. Does that make sense? It's really not that hard, and their formula is really pretty simple. It's hard, though, to stay in a high conflict situation. But remember, if it's too high, it's not productive. If it's too low, which is where we're at all the time, it won't work at all. We take the safe route. And that's even in this annual conference. Let me call out our annual conference. Notice the amount of time we spend on maintenance issues like budgets and pensions. And in fact, some of you were really concerned about the fact that I think Bruce may have said inadvertently, it's more important that the pastor's pension is covered than making new disciples, was the reading that some of you got out of something he said. Well, that's an example of work avoidance for the whole church. We have a technical fix that's getting in the way of our fundamental problem. We're not reaching new people. We're not reaching younger people. We got to tackle that head on. Okay? And that's a complex issue, though. All right, go ahead.
I hate to always be saying something, but going back through my past of 40-something years, 30 years of my own ministry and plus of being a pastor's spouse. So what I'm seeing here is yes, but what I don't see is, well, what is the answer to what happens? Are they saying it's okay to go ahead and bust hell wide open to get what you want? And another example of my childhood was a conflict in a church where a man came in with a gun to shoot the pastor. You know, you'd think that would have made me run from the ministry. But I have my own situation right now, and I'm looking at I can understand a lame duck president. In other words, the question was, are you able or willing to handle the circumstance?
Right.
You know, and so you get to a point, as we get older, we get to a point, are we willing to go through busting hell wide open? In other words,
okay.
You hear what I'm saying?
Sure. It's the safe route always for the leader to take the easy way out, which is to just go with technical fixes and reduce the anxiety of any organization. That's the easy way out. But that's not the Jesus way. Jesus disrupted the system so much that he lost his life. And so the adaptive folks talk about this all the time. The leader is going to get assassinated at the worst. You're going to get marginalized. You're going to get thrown under a bus. You're going to be character assassinated and scapegoated. All of those things are what's in store for the leader who keeps up the conflict and pressure. And we've got to accept that. All right? But that's Jesus' model. He so disrupted the order, he called in question the economy, he called in question the politics, and he called in question the religion. And everybody was after him. But God had a different story at the end. And the story was, that's leadership. That's me. That's God, actually, at its God's best. All right? So it's not going to be easy for any of us. Laity leaders, clergy leaders. Julie's point was, you may get assassinated at the worst. I doubt that's the extreme. But at the minimum, the system is going to try to disempower you, make you seem like a crank, you name it. The system will do that to leadership. Yeah. David.
Bishop, you know that leadership is about asking really good questions. And can you give us any pointers on how we as leaders might diagnose some of what's going on in our local situations to say, okay,
Sure.
we're dealing with the color of the carpet to say what's really going on.
Sure. That's the name of the game, is that you intervene and say, it's not about the color of the carpet, folks. It's about what cultural values are going on in this argument. And it depends on what the church context is. Sometimes it's a long-standing feud between two people who have factions. And this is another thing. You got to deal with factions in the church. How you constructively help those factions. So it really depends on the context. But let me give you one for the annual conference. Why do we talk about Native ministries all the time? It's a core value of us, but we don't do much about it. We really don't. I mean, why don't we do more commitment to Native ministries as a conference? I've always wondered that. I'm at fault as much as you all. So that's the tough question for this annual conference. We speak the words, but our actions don't follow them.
Then you have to question whether it's a core value.
Exactly. Well, it's an espoused value. Everybody says that's in our top three, but nothing gets done about it. Or we just say, Charlie, you go do that. Charlie can't do it by himself. Until some of us as a faction move into that area, then something's going to happen. Otherwise, we just mouth the words. Yeah, go ahead. Yep. We're the perpetrator. Okay.
And we're afraid.
Cool. That.
Because even in Charlie's message to us, we all were able to experience an element
I hear you.
The shame of the father is upon the daughter.
I hear you.
And so when I myself
Issues. Yeah. Those are exactly the kind of complexity that we've got to deal with on a deep level. But how many times do we have this discussion on a deep level about Native ministries? Those questions need to be wrestled with. And I agree totally with you. But if they aren't wrestling inside of us, then we're going back to reduce your anxiety and letting the system just roll along as it rolls along. And you've done very well, we've done very well in terms of finances. And so we're just happy little campers until those questions start really bugging us individually and we step out to try to tackle them. Yeah, I'm ready if you guys are too. Go ahead, Line.
I think that part of the answer to the question of Native ministries being a focus of conversation but not of action and ministry can be found in the analysis that's usually applied to individuals or families. When you say, if you want to find out what the family's real priorities are, you examine the checkbook.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that's true about our institutional priorities as well. And to focus on Native ministry with our resources, primarily thinking our financial resources, we're going to have to start transferring some of our funding into that area of ministry.
Amen. Amen. Now that's an active reality. Yeah, David?
My initial thoughts to that sort of question is, maybe I'll talk to you after the session.
Sure,
and
definitely.
I can tell you some of these because I'm afraid of whose toes I might step on and who I might offend if I tell you what I see as perhaps some of the reasons.
But that's work avoidance, David. That's exactly the example of us being so polite and so nice. And this happens in the Council of Bishops. That's our big dysfunction. We just, we're so polite to each other. We don't offend anybody. And nothing ever gets done because of that. So go ahead and take the risk if you want to. Yeah.
But then again, well, I was going to go on and say that actually is probably part of the problem. But going to what Ev says, there's some cultural values,
of course,
that we measure things on a efficiency sort of model.
Right.
Well, I know in the NUPAC values and also the UPIC, I'm not sure about all the different groups in Alaska because those aren't groups present in our region. But there are a few things. Respect for elders. If you have one elder that disagrees, it's not going to happen.
Sure.
Avoidance of conflict.
Sure.
It's been changed in some of the recent statements of values, but on the older ones it says avoidance.
Sure.
Someone's realized it's unhealthy and said management or avoidance of unhealthy conflict. The other thing is that I mentioned the elders, and this is very similar. The decision-making process is not democratic. It's a consensus. And until everyone agrees, nothing is going to happen.
Sure.
And when you start coupling this with what Ev is saying about where are the colonists?
Right.
And they're saying you need to adapt your culture if you really want to make progress on this.
I hear you.
It gets into some very difficult values, and like you're saying about the Puerto Rican woman saying that that's culturally insensitive, or even worse, that's racist.
Right.
Most of us don't like that, and it's pretty serious accusation and sparks some self-examination that may cripple some of these efforts.
I hear exactly what you're saying. So what we have here, a diagnosis, is a cultural class of values. The values of Native people are not our values. Can we impose ours? No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is we avoid the issue of Native ministries by not engaging it like we're doing today. We just mouth the words that it's important for us. And I think that we're in the zone now. We're getting to the zone. We're not quite into it. We're getting to that zone of truth-telling that we really need to get to, by the way. So I'm going to push you guys I have been pushing you, but we're going to continue to push on this. Go ahead, Dawn.
So I think you could probably identify some really critical adaptive some issues that we need to deal with in our conference. So why, instead of dismissing us for 3 hours this afternoon, were we not able to stay together and at least pick maybe our biggest issue and have us all deal at the time that we're all in the same room?
That's not work avoidance, nor that's pushing the group to say, will you sacrifice some time in order to deal with some things? Yeah, that's not me, that's all of you.
Going back.
Oh, well, okay, I own that, but now it's on the group to say, do you want to do this now? That's what I'm saying, yeah. Okay, so the authority figure, which is a big part of their problem, is to sit down. And if you think that this is going real well, then what I need to do is sit down and let you all tackle this. That's the way they operate, the adaptive folks operate. So let's try it out. But go ahead, Deborah.
I'm going back to the Native culture. I teach Native culture at the museum in Juneau. Two of the other things of Native culture is sharing and also the care of the land. And what I see in these values that the Native people have, well, guess what? If you look at white culture, we don't respect elders. We look down on people who are older, basically. We don't care for the land. Share. We're more interested in making money. We're not interested in sharing. I mean, as a society. I mean, look at the society picture. And we don't make decisions by consensus. It's what's best for us. You know, how's it going to benefit me? I mean, we have a total different slant than the Native people look at it. So if we want to start dealing with Native issues, we need to own where our society comes from and think about what we can learn from the Native people.
Years ago, my deceased husband went into ANVIC when we first were invited to come in. And he took his culture in and, in a sense, almost demanded that they fit his routine and almost shut down the ministry in ANVIC. And what David is saying is so absolute. First of all, I always said, well, number one, I don't have many around me, therefore I'm not called into it. Not me particularly, but in general. So, one, we don't always feel called into it because it's not locally around us. Secondly, we don't go with the respect of, and often when we do anything we look at it as a charity. We create an atmosphere that they feel dehumanized. And one of the happenings that happened in Kuwait when the military guys were bringing toys to the children, the fathers felt dehumanized because it said to them they couldn't provide for their children. So first.
Oh, who's?
Take your pick.
Amen. Thanks, Lonnie. Appreciate that. Thanks for all of the hard work in that too. Thanks for everybody staying around. We'll promise to try to